go to the next session, which is to be moderated by Pranab Ranjan Choudhury. He has been an important figure in the land domain for many years. He is the pivotal figure behind the India Land Development Conference every year, which has become such an important landmark on land governance issues every year in India. Welcome, Pranav, and thank you very much for agreeing to moderate and take forward this important session, which actually, surprisingly today or yesterday, I think BK Agarwal's paper has appeared on this very issue. So as although he chaired the last session, his very valuable comments appeared in print today or was it yesterday, I think, on the whole land leasing question and way forwards in agriculture. So over to you, Pranav. Please steer the conversation in the next hour and a half. You have a very wonderful panel and we are looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And getting such an appreciation from a stalwart like you in the land sector is always very inspiring. And very happy to be here. Very happy to be part of this NCEER's land policy initiatives. Very great beginning in terms of what you call India Land Forum. Though it is virtual, but we have seen the interest, and yesterday there was a very good beginning to it. And I was also listening to the conversation last session. So we are really very happy to be part of it. And we must appreciate the kindness of the organizers to allow us to host this session together with World Bank, with my friend Mercedes Stickler, who is the study team manager of a study that we undertook, and where Dr. Haque was the senior advisor to the study. So basically, today's presentation and panel discussion comes out of the study. So before we start, and all our panelists are here, so let me take a while to welcome them. I'll be introducing them, each of them very soon. We have Mika Torhonen, who is the senior land administrator from Land Bank. Hi, Mika. We have Dr. Saurabh Garg, Principal Secretary, Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, Government of Odisha. Sir, can you please switch on your video? And welcome, sir. And Dr. Haque needs no introduction because he was the person who delivered yesterday the keynote address. And Mercedes, welcome, Mercedes. You have a nice background behind you. Good to have you. Yeah. And also, can I request Shipra Deo of Director Women Land Right India, Landesa, to also switch on the video. So we have a very good panelist. We together in them they blend more than hundreds years of experience with global policy research, national policy research in agriculture and land space, as well as public administration and agriculture experience. They have come with a lot of experience in practice and also research. So we have a wonderful panel to discuss to unfold. Before that, just let me take a couple of minutes to contextualize this session in the context of the agenda of this particular land forum, which is about data-driven research and evidence for land policy in India. So as you look at data in India, we all know India is very rich in data. And also India has, with open data policy, with right to information, with digital advancement, we found a very proactive data policy where a lot of data already available in public domain. And in that context, if you look at land data ecosystem is also fairly well developed. Thanks to Digital India Land Use Modernization Program, which made a beginning long back, as Dr. Haque was telling, in 1989, when he was launching a central sector scheme from NIRD. So it has made a lot of progress, and the evaluation of NCAER's NLRSI also provide a glimpse of where we are now. Though there are challenges, but I think we are much more advanced in terms of other countries. At the same time, if you look at land information, there is NSSO, there is agriculture census, there is housing data from census, there is socioeconomic caste census, India Human Development Survey, National Family Health Survey. So these are all national level data set which are coming through state level agency and non-state actors which are complementing the data space around land data. But If you look at in the context of leasing, there is a huge potential, but in terms of evidence, even if you look at women land right, land leasing, when you look at particularly land issues, the evidence and research, the way this data should be informing policy is not happening. And there are, I think, many reasons behind this, but it is in a particular contrast to the way post independence land reform process, the way it was informing land policy in that period, that has not happened post 90s. If you look at post reform land policy space, this 60s to 90s, lot of research from NSS, although NSS doesn't capture everything, but lot of resources, and it has guided completely land reform. Even the whole land reform agenda comes from data around small farm efficiency. So that way, if you look at from 60s to 90s, a lot of influence was there, the way data was used. But post 90s, though data richness has occurred, but I think the policy linkages have been a little limited. And this is particularly very true in the context of land leasing. One of the reasons behind that, land leasing was banned. So one land leasing ban, DLRMP, which was in many states, this RORs which are recording what do you call RTC, record of tenancy and cropping in the states like Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh. So they stopped almost recording tenancy. So as a result of it, tenancy data was not available. And while NSSO, agriculture census, ISDS, they tried to capture tenancy data, but their methodology were widely different. And the way they captured this data were also not representing it. But nevertheless, there are some researchers, I will not say, so it is limited, but some researchers like Rao, like Vikas Ravel, so many of them have used this data to really influence, try to influence the policy with some kind of research evidence. Even the whole India Human Development Survey, which NCAER leads, that data has been used to link with fallow land and tenancy data by Raghunandan and others, and there has been some remarkable evidence coming in. So if you look at this context, so there is really a time has come where there is more opportunities emerging, how the data can be used to really inform the policy, particularly in the context of land leasing. Why it's so? Because one reason is that new land leasing policy, that Dr. Haque was the chairman who was architect behind the policy, this model act, and the model act was already implemented in 4 states of India, and other states like Odisha, Punjab, and Karnataka are looking towards that. So when the new act comes, if the data is there, so definitely it will be useful. Second thing is that when Mercedes presents our paper, we'll be looking at that, how this data is critical for success of the flagship agricultural rural development schemes. The schemes include National Rural Livelihood Mission, PM Kishan, the state scheme like Kalia in Odisha, Raitu Bandhu in Telangana. So that way, I think these schemes can really make the impact much better if the data is coming in and a feedback is given. And most importantly, if you look at whole agriculture transformation agenda that government is trying to bring in, and the new acts that came up recently, they can really also make a good impact if women farmer, if Dalits, and if the tenants and sharecroppers are included. And for that also we need to have a lot of data sets, which I think again Mercedes will be trying to show with some good examples. Similarly, if you look at the fallow lands, which are increasing in terms of area and particularly post 90s, so that can also be better addressed if you have the data. So in this context, this study was designed, which we conducted and which we're going to present by World Bank, and Mercedes was leading the study. And from India, I was coordinating with where advisors like Dr. Haque and Dr. Binod Agrawal were guiding us. And this study tried to look at the tenancy reform in India, the whole process. And here we produced a national background paper, which is available online now for your, and the feedbacks have been given and will be shortly publishing the final one, which analyzes the organization performance of Land Leasing Act, the Model Land Leasing Act in the states, and also look at the flagship schemes like NRLM, PM Kishan, Kalia, and Raitu Bandhu. We also produced 3 state background papers These states like Bihar, Odisha, and Maharashtra, we try to look at the legal issue framework around land leasing in these three states and try to look at the challenges and suggest the recommendations for way ahead. We also looked at two state projects. One is in Odisha, this NRTP and SMART in Maharashtra, and tried to see how these projects can be more inclusive in terms for tenants and women. Apart from that, we tried to look at 7 case studies. They like from Kudumbashree to SREP to WGW studies, so different cases where state and non-state actors were bringing institutional technological innovations and trying to address the access of land leasing. So these studies together, which will be very shortly available online for public consumption, I think will in a way provide some enriching insights into the way data is used and data can be used to inform the policy discourse. So with this, let me introduce today's the first speaker, our presenter, Mercedes Stickler. Mercedes is an agricultural economist at the World Bank, where she works to improve the sustainability and profitability of the smallholder agriculture and to secure rural land tenure in Africa and South Asia. Mercedes has over 10 years of professional experience in project design and management, research and evaluation, development and partner coordination, including at the USAID and at the World Bank, also at the WRI. She has led land tenure research and operations in more than 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in Cambodia and Myanmar, and has authored and presented numerous papers at and a World Bank book on topics related to land tenure and agriculture development and natural resource management in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Mrs. Stickler earned her master's degree from Rhodes University in South Africa with the support of US Fulbright Scholarship, and she has a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University of Evanston, Illinois. She also happened to work in a World Bank project in Himachal. I welcome Mercedes and I request you to make the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Pranav, for that excellent introduction to this session. I'm just going to try and pull up a few slides here, so bear with me one moment. Okay. Are you able to see my slides?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Very good. So as Pranav mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some of the results of our land policy study focused specifically on land leasing reform today. I'm going to first present just a few overview statistics on the context of land tenancy or land leasing in India, terms that we use interchangeably in the paper, and some of the implications for agriculture, which Pranav also introduced in terms of fallowing behavior and access to agricultural benefits and services. Then I'll briefly introduce the Model Agricultural Land Leasing Act, in which Dr. Haque, as Pranav mentioned, was instrumental in developing, and the reaction of some of the states that have so far adopted reforms in response to it. And then I'll propose a key recommendation or two and some conclusions for discussion during the panel before presenting the policy questions that we will be posing to the remaining panelists during the session. So the tenancy context. As Pranav mentioned, in the years following independence in India, I'm sure that all of the participants are well aware, many states introduced various levels of restriction on agricultural land tenancy, aiming to essentially return rights to the tiller of the land. Many of these restrictions, most of them are still in place today, and they vary from, at the top of the table, you can see here the most restrictive states like Kerala, Jammu and Kashmir, Manipur, where there's a complete ban on land leasing without any exceptions. Then there are some states that allow widows, for example, or service members to lease out their land, but otherwise there's a complete ban on land leasing. And then moving down the table further, there are some states that have restrictions specific to the terms of lease agreements, and or have what we term implicit restriction on land leasing. For example, allowing tenants to proactively purchase rights to the land that they have been cultivating for several years. And these could act as a disincentive for landowners to rent out their land in the first place. So we treat those as an implicit restriction. And then there are a handful of states where we found no explicit or implicit restrictions. And I should note that this work follows from the analysis done by the NCAER Expert Committee on Land Leasing, led by Dr. Haque. So as Pranav mentioned, there are several different data sets that attempt to track tenancy trends over time in India based on household survey data. There are not national level official statistics or even state level official statistics, since, as he mentioned, the practice of recording tenancy rights in formal land records has sort of fallen into disrepair with the focus on land ownership records. So I'm going to present just one data set to you today. There are others featured in our paper where we look at the sort of strengths and weaknesses of various data sets. But looking just at the NSSO data, we see that, as Pranav mentioned, tenancy is increasing despite the fact that these restrictions continue to be in place in most states. If you look between 2002 and 2003, and 2012, 2013, the leftmost column, the tenancy incidence, which is the percent of agricultural households leasing in any land, increased during that time period. And moving over to the next circle to the right, as did the percent of land leased in within the total cultivated area. And here there's quite a significant increase at the top of the range, more than doubling, and even a larger increment if you look at the bottom of the range estimate. And it's also clear from these statistics that most tenants continue to be small and marginal farmers, SMF. And this is important to note because land leasing has sometimes historically and even currently been seen by some as a regressive practice, but in fact it is proven to be quite important for land access to the poor in India. And so we'll have some discussion about why we therefore need to ensure that those most vulnerable farmers have access to the benefits to which they are entitled as farmers. And then just a few other notes on the data. On the farthest right column, you can see that the incidence of land leasing among landless tenants, which are tenants who own no land of their own and are pure tenants, so to speak, has apparently decreased, but this may be due to a change in the way that the NSSO defines landlessness. So this again comes to the importance of having strong data to inform policy. And then finally, as Pranav mentioned, although we don't have good statistics on the incidence of women among tenants, there's good anecdotal evidence suggesting that they face additional barriers accessing land through leasing as compared to male farmers. And also that the share of land leased in by Dalits and tribal peoples is lower than their share in the overall population. So we compared, we grouped states according to their level of restriction from that first table I showed, and then looked at how the tenancy incidence, that is the proportion of tenants among all farmers, the percent of leased in area, and the percent of fallow land as a proportion of all cultivated land changed between the 1980s and the 2010s, which is roughly the period following the introduction of the legal reforms restricting tenancy in the 1960s and 70s. You can see here it's not a completely straightforward correlation, and this is admittedly a first crack at it. But what we do note is that, as you might expect, the furthest to the left category here, no explicit or implicit restrictions, shows the largest increase in the leased area, and importantly, a decrease in the fallow land area. And then moving to the right, at the far end, you can see at the complete ban level, there was actually the largest increase in the leased in area and tenancy incidence and the change in fallow land. So this obviously raises perhaps more questions than it answers, but I think it's important to note here that the fact that these restrictions exist in law and regulation is not necessarily changed or at least prevented all people from undertaking land leasing arrangements, and perhaps because it continues to be an economic necessity. And yet it is having some perhaps distortionary implications for the agriculture sector as a whole in terms of leaving more land fallow than might be economically or environmentally optimal. So on the fallowing statistics specifically, as Pranav mentioned, fallow land in India has consistently increased over the last 40 years or so. And the agriculture census data provides respondents several options to explain why they choose to leave their lands fallow, one of which is the unremunerative nature of farming. And we posit that the existing leasing restrictions likely encourage landowners to leave their land fallow instead of leasing it out in the case of land farming itself not being sufficiently remunerative for them. And in fact, Ranganathan and Pandey found a negative correlation between land leasing and fallowing behavior using India Human Development Survey data for 2010 to 2011, where in villages that had predominantly no tenancy, 15% of the land was left fallow and 20% of farmers fallowed any of their land. And in villages with some tenancy, only 5 to 6% of the land was left fallow and 10% of farmers fallowed their land. So again, some important implications for the productivity and efficiency of the sector overall, perhaps of the continued leasing restrictions. As Pranav mentioned, these leasing restrictions also have important implications for tenants' ability to access agricultural benefits and services, which are increasingly linked to land ownership records, typically the form of the so-called record of rights, or ROR. These include direct benefit transfers, farmer-producer organization leadership registration, collateralized agricultural loans and insurance, and some states decentralized public grain procurement, where the record of rights is used to identify the area over which the farmer is eligible to sell their produce to the government. So for tenant farmers who typically lack recorded leases, less than 13% of leases are recorded as per NSSO data, mostly in registers, so not in the record of rights. For tenant farmers without recorded leases and other vulnerable farmers, including most women and Dalits who don't have up-to-date land records, they're often ineligible for agricultural services and entitlements linked to the land ownership records. And while we don't have good data on women's percentage of tenants, we know that they represent 65% of agricultural workers, but only 14% of land rights holders with formally recorded rights. And for Dalits, who represent 20% of households, they own just 9% of cultivable land and represent about 18% of tenants. So potentially a large population of farmers being left out of these programs and not fully empowered to contribute to India's agricultural transformation. So we analyzed the eligibility criteria for several of the flagship direct benefit transfer schemes to assess their level of inclusion of tenants, both in their targeted beneficiaries and among the actual beneficiaries, in comparison to tenants' overall representation among the farming population in the relevant jurisdiction, so national or state level. We should note this is a quite back of the envelope calculation, since there aren't official statistics on tenants, but we wanted to estimate the scope of the challenges that informal and unrecorded rights might pose for the objectives of these schemes, which typically seek to provide farmers with access to capital, and in particular during critical parts of the production cycle. So this table presents, for 4 of the schemes we analyzed, the estimated exclusion of tenants from these direct benefit transfers. On the farthest left is PM Kishan, which is obviously at the all India level, and both this program and Telangana's Ritu Bandhu program exclusively target landowners with recorded land rights. And this is particularly interesting in the context of Telangana, where they undertook a land records updating process to improve the data validity of the digital Patadar passbooks, but they undertook a regulatory change prior to the land records updating program that removed the requirement to record tenants' rights in those passbooks. And so that effectively excluded tenants by design from Ritu Bandhu, even though the Department of Agriculture in Telangana had undertaken almost simultaneous Samagra census that looked at all of the farmers in the state. So if we assess for PM Kishan, the number of tenants who own no land, so these are the quote pure tenants or landless tenants, nationally are estimated to be about 5.76 million. So that's our estimate of the upper bound of the number of tenants who might be excluded as farmers from accessing PM Kishan. And in Ritu Bandhu, our estimate is about 800,000 based on publicly available data on the proportion of tenants among all farmers in the state of Telangana. Moving to the right, both Andhra Pradesh and Odisha have explicitly included both landowners and tenant farmers in their direct benefit transfer schemes. And the Andhra Pradesh Ritu Bharosa scheme database includes tenant farmers. And while Odisha developed its database by triangulating across multiple existing databases maintained by the Agriculture Department and other departments in the state. The overall proportion of tenants within Andhra Pradesh, we had difficulty finding, and so we did not attempt to calculate the extent of exclusion of tenants from Ritu Bharosa. But for Odisha, the publicly available data on the overall proportion of tenants and sharecroppers among farmers suggests that up to 70% of them may be being excluded from Odisha's Kalia direct benefit transfer scheme, despite considerable efforts and intent on the part of the government of Odisha to include them. So the Model Agricultural Land Leasing Act was introduced in 2016 by the NCAER to attempt to formally recognize and incentivize land leasing for economic development and land access for the poor. Some of the key provisions of the Model Act include removing both implicit and explicit restrictions on land leasing, allowing the lease terms to be determined by mutual agreement between the owner and the tenant, strengthening or reaffirming the owner's rights by allowing for automatic resumption of land possession after the lease term ends or following a violation of the lease terms by the tenant. It specifically provides for tenants to access institutional credit and insurance based on an attested written agreement. So hopefully would help them overcome the current lack of access to some of these agricultural services and entitlements. But importantly, the Act is explicit about the fact that the lease agreement should not be recorded in the record of rights. And we may hear more from Dr. Haque about why that decision was made at the time. And the overall objective of the Model Act is, among others, to incentivize tenants to make land improvements and to incentivize landowners to lease out their land so that it can be used productively. 5 states have so far adopted the reforms in response to the Model Act, although one is still awaiting presidential assent in Maharashtra. And the reform process is underway in 3 states. And we believe that there's a considerable scope for increased cross-state knowledge sharing and awareness building to further refine and strengthen new reform initiatives based on lessons learned. And this panel session is, we hope, contributing to that discussion. So I won't go into all the details of the specific state level reforms, but the one I would like to point out is on the lease database, where, as you can see, 2 of the states don't require that the leases be recorded at all, which could, again, be problematic in terms of identifying tenant farmers for eligibility in agricultural programs. And only 1 state, Uttar Pradesh, requires, as of 2019, that the lease agreement be recorded in the record of rights, in this case, in the remarks column, as opposed to a dedicated column recording leases. And then I also want to note that all but Maharashtra, where it's not clear, of the recent state level reforms did explicitly repeal previous acts that may have been providing explicit and, importantly, implicit restrictions on land leasing, which follows on Andhra Pradesh's experience earlier in 2011, where they tried to register tenant farmers without repealing tenant farmers' right to purchase the land. And landlords were understandably unwilling to allow their tenant farmers to register for the loan eligibility cards under the previous act in Andhra Pradesh. So now, hopefully, with the new act in 2019 repealing the previous Tenancy Act, the landlords will be more willing to enter into written recorded agreements with their tenants. So bringing me quickly to the conclusion, we posit and would like to put on the table for discussion with our esteemed panelists today and the audience that it would be useful to register long-term leases in the record of rights. Now, we can debate how long-term is. In the paper, I think we said about at least 1 year. But we make a number of arguments for why this would be a useful reform. First is that the deeds registry only records the transaction using textual documents, not spatial data. So it would not be sufficient for area-based entitlements. And it also does not constitute legal recognition of the land user, and therefore might not provide sufficient tenure security to tenants to incentivize them to make long-term investments in the land they cultivate. As has been noted, many agricultural entitlements are already linked to the record of rights. And so incorporating lease agreements there, either in a dedicated column or in the remarks column, would streamline the identification of tenant beneficiaries and ensure the actual cultivator receives the intended benefits, while avoiding duplicate beneficiaries, which is to say the landowner and the tenant claiming benefits on the same parcel. The record of rights, while it's not perfect, as we heard in the previous session, does constitute some legal recognition of the presumption of land rights to use the land, and therefore is more likely to provide the tenure security needed to make large or long-term capital investments in the land for tenants. And finally, we note that the Ministry of Agriculture, the Union Ministry of Agriculture, is undertaking an exercise to develop a national database of farmers who are eligible for various schemes and services maintained by the union and state level agriculture departments. And in this case, they expect to rely on the state level records. And so having the state level records state level land records incorporate tenants' rights would facilitate conclusive identification of the actual cultivator for agricultural entitlement beneficiary identification, discourage rent seeking and forum shopping, and be more fiscally sustainable than maintaining separate registers of tenant farmers and landowner farmers. And just in closing, I would note that both the Digital India Land Records Modernization Program and state regulations do provide for tenancy rights to be recorded in the Record of Rights, although as Pranav mentioned, this has not been a focus of DILRIMP. They do have a coding scheme that allows for this, and the increasing level of digital linking between the Record of Rights and the Deeds Registry should facilitate automatic updating of lease recording. And at the state level, the states that are pictured here in the table already allow for tenancy arrangements to be recorded, although some of them no longer do this in practice. And only statutory or executive instructions may be needed in other states. So there would not necessarily need to be heavy legal reforms needed to incorporate the tenants' rights in the form of lease agreements in the Record of Rights. So this brings my short presentation to a conclusion, and then I'm just going to display here for the remainder of the session the policy questions that we would like to pose for our esteemed panelists to respond to, and then I'll turn back to Pranav. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. I think very excellent presentation and also right in time. So thanks for sticking to time and also at the same time touching upon all the points that we want to discuss. Just a caveat, what we present is an overall Indian scenario. There could be states where different implications are there. For example, some states while registration also required spatial maps to be provided. So there are state level variations are definitely there, but because it is overall country presentation, so those things have not been discussed in detail for the brevity. We'll open this session for about 5 minutes to take some any clarificatory questions, but we have more questions to we'll be taking subsequently during the panel discussions. So after this, about 5-6 minutes of taking up questions, we will move to panel discussion in 2 rounds among these experts. So I think there is a question already there. No, I don't think. Yeah. I think all of these questions are referring to the earlier session. So, but if there is any pointed questions, any clarificatory questions to the Mercedes presentation, so please feel we can take it directly.
I think Dia Uday has a question related to our presentation, Pranav, which is a good one. In estimating exclusions, do you take into account only landless tenants or tenants regardless of whether or not they also own land? If it is the latter, then they may come into the fold of DBD programs as owners and thereby get covered in some manner by these schemes. That's a very good point, Dia. And we have attempted at the national level to correct for that is to only include the proportion of tenants who are quote unquote landless, who do not also own land in our exclusion estimate. And I believe we had made the same attempt in Kalia in Odisha, but because there's not consistent state level data, I cannot promise you that the state level data are reflective of exclusively the landless tenants. So these may admittedly be upper bounds in terms of the number of tenants that are potentially excluded from these programs. Because as you note, if they own land, in addition to cultivating some land as tenants, they would be covered by some of these schemes. Although in Telangana's case, at least the payments are area based. So even if they do have owned land, they may not receive the full benefit owed to them if they don't have the record proving their ownership rights for that land.
If I may, just one clarification on the presentation that Mercedes made, in which you mentioned that there could be 70% of the tenant farmers possibly excluded from Kalia. But I would just also like to just point out into the previous slide where you mentioned that more than 98% of the tenant farmers are small and marginal farmers. Only as per the data is only 1.5, 1.6%, and that ties in with our data also. So in Kalia, it was a universal scheme for all small and marginal farmers. So while I understand we can't with 100% empirical evidence confirm that whether all tenant farmers were included, but given the universal data that tenancy among landless is limited to 1 to 2 or maybe 3%, perhaps that 70% of tenant farmers being excluded may need to be revisited.
Thank you. That's a very important clarification, Mr. Garg.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Okay, I think then we'll move to the panel discussions, and if there is any question, please feel free to post in the chat box. As Mercedes has put in the last slides, we have 4 set of questions to the 4 expert panelists there with us. So we'll start with the first question with Mika. So the question is, what opportunities exist to leverage the existing policy and institutional frameworks to record tenancy rights, and what can be learned from the global experience? Before that, let me introduce Mika. Mika is a lead land administration specialist at the World Bank based out of Singapore. He's really joining a little late for us. So thanks for joining, Mika, and continue to be with us. He leads the World Bank's land and geospatial program in East Asia Pacific and South Asian regions. Mika is a technical and land administration specialist with close to 30 years of global working experience. His main interest areas are land tenure security, land administration modernization, smart city land system, and public land management. Before joining the bank, Mika worked as a land tenure officer in FAO Rome. He holds a doctorate degree in science from Helsinki University of Technology. So with this, I invite Mika to respond to these questions, and please take also your take on this question, and if you want to add any point. But in the first round, I would request you to limit it to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting paper, which I have read, and very interesting presentation. And I also like to thank the organizers of the event for having me today to address you. It's a great privilege, and I'm just to say personally that I am a student of Indian land tenure and Indian land issues and Indian land opportunities. So I may get some details wrong, and I hope it doesn't. I hope you still bear with me. I think there are opportunities both in terms of globally, global context, and we are seeing also great opportunities within the context of India. And I am working on land records in general. That's what I've been doing for some decades now, and in many countries. And I am a big advocate of inclusiveness in terms of having a land record somewhere, which includes everything in terms of who owns land and who's using land. And so I'm a big, as a matter of principle, as a matter of philosophy, I am a big advocate of tenancy rights, long-term tenancy rights being recorded in a land record together with land ownership rights. And when I talk about inclusive land registry and inclusive land records, I'm also talking about the same record covering all public rights that covers all private rights, the same record covering all areas, and for example, not separating records for public lands or forest lands, but all being in the same place. So in essence, in technically speaking, I'm talking about parcel-based land registry. And I guess one argument to the context today is that if you had such in place, then recording a lease would not require another survey, I guess, because you would have the registered land unit already existing in the system, and then it would be a matter of just recording a lease to that unit. And that brings me to the opportunity that is provided by the Digital India Land Records Monetization Program, because many states have made great progress in integrating and interlinking land records, namely the deeds registry and the record of rights. And that gives a great, and the field book, the cadastral map as well. So that gives a great opportunity to have only one record and no shopping between records, and therefore there would no longer be the issue of, is it enough to register in the deeds registry? Is it enough to register in the record of rights, or should be separate registry? If everything was interlinked, one recording would be enough and it would appear everywhere. So I would like to, so yes, I'm advocating registration of lease rights. Now, a couple of points stemming from the opportunities of our time. So there are international norms that we can at least use as points of advocacy for securing tenure rights. And I would argue that tenancy rights that are not recorded are not secure. And I would also call for decision making to be, so I'm not really a big favor of restrictions related to land use and land use rights. So there is a norm that many of us may have heard, which is the Voluntary Guidelines for Responsible Governance of Tenure. You can find them by Googling FAO and Voluntary Guidelines on Land. And the very first point of those guidelines is that states should recognize and respect all legitimate tenure right holders and their rights. And then when you go down the voluntary guidelines, it's all about everybody who is using land, everybody who has a relationship with land, though that tenure right should be respected. And so I think it's a big movement from old times mantra on land titling and land ownership rights being the key for economic development. I think the voluntary guidelines goes very far, understanding that everybody's right needs to be secured, and that very much, very strongly includes the secondary right holders, the tenancy and the leaseholders. Obviously, the same is underlined also in the Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 1, to end poverty in all forms everywhere by 2030. There is a sub-goal which says secure tenure for all men and women by 2030. And there is a parallel one for gender rights, the rights of women to land secured by 2030. So internationally, the jury is not out there that there is a conclusion all tenure rights should be secured. That very strongly includes also the secondary tenure rights. And perhaps we can argue that the best way could be that they were recorded legally somewhere, but maybe that's an argument that could be contested. Now, I know we're all tired a little bit of the challenges of our time, especially the health crisis, but when we look at news stories, I was Googling a little bit, just waiting for this session to start, about reverse migration going on in India, and I saw some newspapers, so this is unverified, saying that in 2011 statistics, 450 million Indians had migrated to another place for work. So I guess most of them would have migrated to cities. And now we know that because of the health crisis, many of them have returned to their original rural area homes. Now, if land leasing is not allowed, then a person that migrates to urban area when his starting point may have been a smallholder, there's two options then if land leasing is not allowed. Either you informally lease your land to somewhere, or you sell your asset. And that may also be restricted. So there is a very big danger that goodwilling restrictions on leasing may result into sales that impact then the ability for people to return to their small holdings. And then a very big issue of social safety net functionality of a rural smallholder, the place where you can go to and grow food and reside in the times of hardship like we are experiencing now may be lost. So I think it's important to consider that tenure rights, secure tenure rights are actually subject to decision making. So you can actually lease them, you can sell them if it's your best interest and will. And when we restrict these questions, then we may actually impact tenure security, and we may force people to make decisions that may not be in their best interest. And if we draw a parallel, and it's very far, and it's a very different context than India, but 20, 30 years ago, Eastern Europe was full of smallholder farmers. And about that time, there started to be a common joke that nobody's son or daughter wants to be a farmer. So a lot of the smallholders had no continuation in next generation. And there was a big fear that what happens to these rural assets, and oftentimes there were no good land markets either. There was nobody to buy those lands. Nowadays, those lands are of high demand, and most of those smallholder families that nowadays live in urban areas have leased their holdings to the larger agricultural enterprises. And it has been a very big part of kind of filtering and smoothing process of huge transformation, huge urbanization in Eastern Europe. And I think land leasing has played a very, very big role. And it was very good that the smallholders had no incentive or a reason to sell oftentimes, but they hang on to their assets and they can continue to benefit those for years to come, if not generations to come. So yes, so my 5 minutes was there, and I'm making the point of land leasing systems, functioning land leasing systems are important to society, and registration of rights is a very good way of securing secondary tenancy rights. And there is a international public policy in support of that. And I think this is a good discussion, because I think this is an important topic for India to make progress with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika. I think you raised a range of issues globally and locally, connecting from FAO's specificity to East European context to the secondary tenure documentation, and coming to the COVID context. I think this is very important opportunity for India in the context of COVID to see if tenancy right, because most of the people who migrate they migrate because of land deprivation. So, and when they have come back, and while a lot of fallow lands are available, there is also an opportunity to use the fallow lands through some kind of secure tenure rights. Thank you very much for your intervention. Now I'll have the next opportunity to request Dr. Haque, who is the architect of this land leasing reform in India, to share his remark on the question which goes like this. Given the limited implementation of historical and recent land leasing reform, what additional policy and institutional reform are needed to facilitate wider adoption and implementation of the Model Act? This is something very important. Many states are not adopting it. So what additional policy and institutional reform are required? And particularly including those which can address the widely held perceptions that formalizing tenant rights poses an existential threat to the landowner's right, and concerns that small farmers may be at a disadvantage vis-a-vis large farmers in the farmer lease market. So Dr. Haque needs no introduction because I think most of you know him. When you talk about land and agriculture in India, he is the person who is always referred to for advice and guidance. He has rich experience of working with Government of India, advising Government of India, Niti Aayog, being the Commissioner of Agriculture Cost and Prices, and as well as a lot of international experience of working with World Bank, FAO, IFRI, and others. So I request Dr. Haque to kindly share his thoughts on these particular issues. Thank you, sir. Sir, your mic is mute. Please unmute and.
Thank you, Pranav. I think how much time I have? 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes?
Sir, if you want to give it in 2 rounds, 5 minutes. If you want to give it in 1 round, 10 minutes.
I see. Okay. So let me see. Because 5 minutes is too less, but anyway, I will try. First of all, I think I must say that Stickler, the paper she presented is quite comprehensive and it covered almost all aspects of the issues that confront the land leasing reform. So I'll not repeat those, but then I just wanted to add one more sentence that when you say AP, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, and West Bengal, there are no explicit or implicit restrictions. I think there are some restrictions, and that is the reason even in those states there is need for land leasing reform. Say, for instance, if you say in most of these states, particularly in AP, Tamil Nadu, and Rajasthan, a period of lease has to be for a certain period. They say at least minimum 5 years. In the case of AP, it is 6 years. So if you say that this has to be like that, then there will be people who are interested to lease in land maybe for a year, for 2 years, 3 years, for various reasons. And also there are people who are interested to lease out land only for a short time. So that will not be captured that way. So there are these restrictions also come in the way of active land lease market and also benefiting the poor people. Then West Bengal allows only sharecropping. They don't allow fixed rent tenancy or fixed produce tenancy. So that again has a problem. And not only that, they cannot be evicted easily. In West Bengal, the laws are so strict that the tenants simply cannot be, sharecroppers cannot be simply evicted. So these are some of the things which come in the way of active land lease market there. So this is one. So that's why they also need to reform. In fact, I had discussion with all these states, particularly AP several times, Rajasthan also, and West Bengal. Tamil Nadu not really. Then getting accurate data on informal land leasing is certainly difficult, as you mentioned. There are issues because people sometimes, since it is not legal, people will not say that he has leased out or he has leased in. So I think that limitation will be there. But then there is also, if in the context of land leasing, why it is not progressing, and if you think about the way forward, then there are certain misunderstanding or misconceptions at various levels, at the political level, at the bureaucracy level, and also on the ground among some people, that if you legalize or liberalize, large farmers mainly will try to lease in more land, and the land ownership pattern will change, and more and more land alienation will take place from the marginal small landholder side. I want to say, under the present situation, when the existing ceiling laws continue, there is no way anybody can acquire land beyond ceiling, as per law, if the law is strictly implemented. So that fear actually does not stand. So I think people have to tell all those who matter in the system that this is not true and this can be addressed this way. Secondly, is in the context of women tenant farmers, you mentioned something about it, that I think in the land lease market, women are not so much. In the problem with us, as you know, women farmers in general are not recognized, even otherwise. Even though, as I said yesterday also, 45 to 68% of the women are in agriculture. But even then, I think there is no formal recognition for them. And as a result, in the lease market also, they are absent mostly. But then there are examples, as I mentioned yesterday also, under Kudumbasri or under APMSS in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. I think there are some good examples, not of ownership or but at least they are leasing in land and the government supports them. Then, and through land reforms or the tenancy reforms, the kind of thing that we have done, so much injustice to women, particularly take the case of Karnataka. Karnataka, even widows were not spared. In fact, in the case of others, at least if you are widows and disabled that way and not able to cultivate land yourselves, you are allowed to lease out. But in the case of Karnataka, even widows are not allowed to lease out. Only the soldiers and the defense personnel who are on the border, they are exempted. So that way, this kind of restrictions also come in the way of women's, participating in the lease market either as a lessee or as a lessor. So I think this is one. Then also I need to tell at this stage that unless you update land record, there is still many landowners will feel insecure to lease out, because if you don't have a proper title and lease out land to somebody, you will be scared to lease out because you think suddenly somebody will create problems about ownership and then he will lose his land rights. So I think land record is equally important. I should say both updating land record or accurate land record along with land legalization of land leasing should go together. Then about land leasing restriction, registration, of course, under the new law, if it is for more than a year, it has to be registered. But people have a fear because they have the hangover of the past, thinking that if you register, it will be known and by the government. And again, in some cases, even the ceiling laws will be applicable because the operational holdings come under this, not necessarily the ownership. In some of the states, it is not only ownership holdings, but even the operational holdings. And secondly, they think once it is registered, there can be a change of government at some time when they will say, no, these are all registered tenants, so they should be given some kind of, again, permanent heritable rights. And then the landowners will feel scared, the thinking that they will lose their land rights. So I think these are the issues which need further discussion, and then how to go about it. We have to decide. Similarly, I think suppose that you have leased out land to a particular person for 5 years, and then you die. Then your son and daughter, who has to again negotiate with the new tenant or the tenant, suppose he says, no, I don't want to lease out that piece of land. It comes back to the new person who has generated that piece of land. In that case, if the tenant has made some investment on such agricultural land or any land for that matter who has leased in, he should be sure that he does not lose his investment amount. At least if value of a particular tube well, say for instance, the life of a tube well is for 10 years and he has used it only for 2 years, 3 years. Then for the remaining period, whatever is the value that has either to be paid back to the tenant or what does he do otherwise? He will say, so in that kind of uncertain situation, no tenant will make long-term investment. So I think that also has to be put somewhere in the new legal framework that we're suggesting. But anyway, activizing land lease market and even the land sale market are critical for economic growth, investment and economic growth, as we know, because land is needed not only for agriculture, it is needed also for infrastructure, both physical and social. It is also needed for industries, and it needs for overall, process of economic transformation. So I think you need to keep that also in mind, and it should not be so much restrictive because again, some states say, no, I think this should not be allowed. This should be allowed only by the small and marginal farmers or only between them or whatever. And that will not help. It has to be designed in a manner which not only helps the process of inclusive growth for the poor people, but also the process of transformation, industrial change or infrastructure development and all that. Because these infrastructure projects, again, one of the things which we normally miss is that infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure or some kind of welfare considerations, particularly about social infrastructure. This also should be used in a manner that generates some surplus, used for further investment, either infrastructure or other economic activities, which again speeds up the growth process and which can further allow you to absorb more and more people from agriculture to non-agriculture, because that is the process that we have to have anyway. So I think I will stop it here, and then if there is anything.
Thank you, sir. I think, as usual, always your breadth of experience and knowledge is immense around this particular sector, and the way you try to touch upon the issues from different states is really very useful, and it will provide a good insight to the whole discussion and to take the conversation forward. With this, I come to the our third important discussion today, Dr. Saurabh Garg. So the question before you is, I think this is a broad question, but you can take your response accordingly. How can greater cooperation be incentivized among institutions at the federal level, particularly Department of Land Resources, Ministry of Agriculture, Farm Welfare, Ministry of Panchayat Raj, and also at the state level, for example, Revenue Department, Agriculture, Panchayat Raj institutions, to maximize the impact of leasing and land record reform, particularly in agriculture transformation? Do we learn any lessons from the existing state schemes in this regard, such as Kudumbashree in Kerala, SCRP, IKP Bhumi in Andhra Pradesh, and particularly Kalia and Balram in Odisha? Before I open pose the question to you, let me have the privilege to also introduce Dr. Garg before you. Dr. Saurabh Garg is presently the Principal Secretary, Agriculture and Farmers Empowerment Department, Government of Odisha. He was former Joint Secretary at Government of India, Investment and Currency in the Department of Economic Affairs. He has also had several responsibilities at Government of Odisha in the Department of Industry, Urban Development. I think he was also one of the earlier mission director of Watershed Mission in Odisha, and has also worked in World Bank. He has also worked in private sector with Tata Admission Services. He has a PhD in International Economics and Development from the Johns Hopkins University, USA, and has an MBA from International Management, Ahmedabad, where he was awarded a gold medal. He holds a BTech from IIT New Delhi, and was also a Gurukul Severding Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, London. He has published several articles and contributed to books in different areas of including innovations in administration and corporate governance. Last but not the least, Dr. Garg is leading a kind of rare reform in the state of Odisha around agriculture. We are trying to include tenants and sharecroppers. So Kalia and Balram, and then including the farmers in agricultural insurance are some of them. And Odisha is also the pioneering state where the paddy procurements, sharecroppers are given the privilege. So he's also leading, trying to push Government of Odisha for implementing the Model Land Leasing Act in the state. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, and it's a privilege for me to be a part of this webinar, and thank you for inviting me. I'll just have a few points on the question that you raised to me specifically, and some of the other questions that were raised earlier. The first point on land leasing, I would just like to state two things of land leasing in Odisha. Number one is it is on an increasing trend. If we see the last decade and the previous decade and the percentage of land that has been leased, it is increasing. So that's one thing, which is also nationally the case, I assume. And the second point, which I just want to mention, which perhaps has not received enough attention, is the fact that in Odisha, in the terms of lease, nearly 70% of the leased in area is covered by a share of produce, the sharecropping. While nationally, it is perhaps the reverse, that more than 60 or 70% is on a fixed money contract. So that is just one flag I want to just raise, that obviously the risk profile in each is different, and how much the risk the sharecropper or the tenant has to bear changes with that. And that could be interesting to examine going forward. The second point is on the recently introduced agri reforms bills and the contract farming. I think they are a step forward in the issue of land leasing. I'm not saying that contract farming substitutes land leasing, but at least we have moved a step forward, and I think that itself is heartening. But one issue which I just want to flag is on why is land leasing such a topic which is not easily acceptable across states? It's not only in Odisha, across, and Dr. Haque is very well aware of that. And I think that we need to step back and look at a broader level. And perhaps it's also related to the fact of what we may call as the enforcement of contracts. In India, I think the doing business studies have highlighted that issue as an area where we need considerable improvement. And I think that carries across both the rural and the urban area. In the rural area, it manifests itself in terms of fallow land or in terms of non-written or oral leases. And in the urban area, it manifests itself in vacant property or houses not being let out to tenants. And I think the basic issue is the same, the fear of the landowner or the property owner on what happens in case the tenant decides to continue for longer. And I think that's a legacy issue also. But I think perhaps a too narrow a focus on land leasing may not really lead us far unless and until we tackle the basic issue on the enforcement of the contract, and that any contract which is entered would be honored and it will not take too much time. And I think that's an area where perhaps we need to give more focus when we're talking about issues related to land leasing, or for that matter, urban property residential leasing. And I just want to reiterate once again, they're not very different. The concept behind both is very similar, and we need to give more attention on that. Coming specifically to Kalia and then Balram, I would just like to mention a couple of things. Number one, we made Kalia extremely inclusive, that all small and marginal farmers are included. And our analysis showed that more than 95%, in fact, it's closer to 97 to 98% of tenant holders are small and marginal. Very few tenant holders are landless, and that also would be intuitively right, given the fact that farming requires, I would say, a certain entrepreneurship and an entrepreneurial skill. And that also requires how to manage assets, the skill to manage assets. A landless laborer does not have the skills or the entrepreneurial skills to manage assets. And therefore, the possibility of them going in for land leasing or becoming tenants is much lower. And therefore, once you universalize all small and marginal farmers, the possibility of any tenant farmer being left out is very rare. Our analysis also showed that most of these small and tenant farmers were small and marginal farmers. That is, they had up to 5 acres of land or up to it. There were very few farmers who had, let us say, 10 acres of land and then they became tenant farmers, because tenancy has some amount of social, stigma attached to it, that you are a farmer. So a farmer who has reasonable amount of lands, which may be 7, 8, 10 acres, the probability of them going in for tenancy is very low. So, and that's the point I was making earlier, that if you include all small and marginal farmers, perhaps more than 95% of the tenancy. Two other things in Kalia we did. We included agricultural laborers, and we looked at self-declaration and a public display of names that people are saying that they are tenant and landless laborers, and we found it to be extremely effective. And to include more women farmers in Kalia, if 2 persons of the same household applied, we opted to retain the name of the women household, because our scheme kept only 1 person per farm family. So straight away, by ensuring that the amount goes to the women member of that household, we ensured slightly greater gender equality. And in fact, that's why nearly 30% of our Kalia beneficiaries are women. That is as far as Kalia goes. The other scheme that we have introduced during COVID, in fact, in June 2020, is Balram. And what we are doing essentially is again focusing on tenant farmers and landless farmers, essentially any cultivator who is not able to produce a ROR, a land title or a record. So we are focusing on that. We have tweaked the joint liability groups guidelines which already existed by giving a certificate of cultivation from the agriculture department. And we've done it purposely from the agriculture department because it has no legal sanctity. It cannot be used to go into court because only the revenue department has the ability to issue a certificate of cultivation which is legally admissible. But this certificate of cultivation helps the farmer get credit from the banks because the banks are willing to take that as some kind of a documentary proof that that person is cultivating. So for the limited purpose of credit, it works, and that's our objective. We don't want to get into the legal issues around land leasing, which I mentioned. And we are not asking for a confirmation from the revenue department because then it becomes entered into the ROR and that issues of rights and obligations come in. So we've started this, and the initial reports that we have are extremely positive. We will see how going forward, how we can strengthen this. The last two points which I just want to make. One is on the draft land leasing, which we are at the moment circulating within, and it's internally under examination. We are also including post-harvest management activities as possible for land leasing, because I think given the recent bills that have been introduced and given our focus on doubling land farmers, doubling farm income, we cannot do that without ensuring that the farmer also participates slightly higher up in the value chain in primary processing, in farm processing, in what is the assaying, sorting, grading, and itself raise the income that you will get from the same produce. So post-harvest management as an activity which should be included for land leasing agricultural land, we have kept that, and let us see how we proceed on that. That's number one. The second issue is that we've recently launched our farmers database. We've been in discussion with Government of India on this, and we are perhaps the first one to get it off the ground. And we have made an initial database of around 80 lakh for farm families. And we are now getting into the ground truthing, the ground verification. And we hope to have all-inclusive farmers database in the next, we have said 100 working days is what we will take to verify it. And it includes cultivators, it includes those engaged in livestock and fishery activities, it includes those engaged in farm forestry activities, and it also includes agricultural laborers. So I think that's something we are implementing, and I'm sure that will help our implementation of programs as we go ahead across departments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for outlining the Odisha's work. And I think Odisha has been a pioneering state in terms of inclusive growth, and the schemes like from paddy procurement to Kalyan, Balaram, to looking at land, this post-harvest management for around land leasing, and also the farmer database, they demonstrate that. And also in terms of institutional technical innovation, the way the digital innovation have been used in Kalia, that share a lot about that. But sir, one thing I wanted to also highlight with you, I think that the particular percentage that was shared by Mercedes, it is based on a kind of estimate. I think we'll double check with that. But if you look at NSSO somehow is talking about 18.5% of the tenants in Odisha are landless as per 2012-13. I think Odisha has also availability of the recent data set from NABARD's NAFI survey, which is not exactly available in to the public domain, all segregations. I think we need to also look at that, and particularly it will be very important to see if these landless tenants are included, which already Odisha is including sharecroppers, small farmers in a big way. Thank you very much, sir. With that, I'll now move to see, this is something which always were criticized at ILDC, that we always make our panels as manels. So we are all men, sometimes sitting and talking about farmers, and essentially farmers, as we see the data and statistics, most of the farmers are women. So Shipra also made that point, Pranav, why you want me only to talk about women and Dalits, that is not looking good. So I think this is very much correct. So fortunately, we had with Mercedes and Shipra. And Shipra, many of you already know her for her work around women land right in India. Shipra, the question to you is, what additional policies and investment may be needed to ensure that land leasing reform in particular and agriculture transformation more broadly are fully inclusive, particularly including women, farmer, and Dalit? Before I hand it over to you, Shipra, let me have the privilege to introduce you before the audience. I think those of you are not aware of you. Shipra leads Landesa's work to strengthen women land right in India. She's a development practitioner with more than 20 years of experience in managing multidisciplinary programs addressing women's empowerment, women land rights, violence against women, agriculture, collective action, livelihood, and institution building. She has experience of working with international agencies like UNDP, USAID, and BMGF, and has also worked with state governments and national as well as grassroots organizations. She has worked closely with development projects in South Asia, Africa, and Central Europe with focus on gender mainstreaming. And moreover, he is a close friend to all of us, and he has been a kind of source of inspiration in our work around gender and agriculture and land rights. Welcome, Shipra.
Thank you so much, Pranav, for making me a part of this very important discussion. It was really a pleasure to listen to my previous panelists and fellow speakers. So, as you asked about making inclusive the agricultural transformation in general and leasing reform in particular, I think I'll begin with broader agricultural transformation first, and then come to leasing specifically. And I think one of the foundational things which is needed for agriculture to be inclusive in general, I think, is the independent recognition of women as farmers and as tillers. Dr. Haque spoke a little about it, but I think the land reform policies at the time of independence had all been based on the policy of land to the tiller, and the tiller was almost always seen as a male, and it continues to be the same till date. Most of the revenue laws that are operational in several states, almost all the states today, they were conceived in colonial times, and that was a time when even in European countries, laws were patriarchal and they didn't see women as equal or independent landholders. So this bias of the British rulers at that time, I think, only intensified the patriarchal construct of Indian revenue laws. As a result, when I review the state revenue laws, I find two very, very significant biases. One is that in a lot of state revenue laws, specifically in the northwestern states, such as UP, Uttarakhand, Himachal, and Punjab, Haryana, etc., there are separate inheritance provisions which govern inheritance of agricultural land. And in all these states, women receive inferior rights to agricultural land. Mostly they receive very limited rights, which are just for their lifetime and which are just user rights. And their ownership and access to the agricultural land is dependent on their marital status and the relationship with men. So that to me sounds like a very significant bias. Secondly, I think in all these states, in all these state revenue laws, land as such is treated as a male prerogative. If we look at the UP revenue laws, right from the UP ZALR, Bihar Tenancy Act, Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act, all of these see male as the prime tenure holder. They define a landholder as a male, and it's, I mean, not just the landholder, but also a tenant, a lessor, a lessee, bataidar, bataidar, and even the revenue officer, district collector. All these words are used assuming male to be the default. So I think the language of the tenancy laws is by default highly androcentric. And interestingly, I think I was studying Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act a few days back, and I did a word count just out of curiosity. And I noted that the act used the pronoun he 177 times and the word his 276 times. But simultaneously, at the same time, pronoun she is just not used anywhere in the act, not even a single time. And her is only used, only once when it was being referred to some, tenancy kind of a relation. So that is the extent to which these laws have male biases. Consequently, what happens is the officials in the revenue departments who read these laws and have the responsibility to implement them on ground, they carry these biases and they see men as landholders and they see men as farmers. Even when there are initiatives to increase women's ownership of land through provisions such as joint titling, they get defeated by these deep-seated patriarchal values within the revenue officials and the implementers of policies. For example, if we take example of UP and Maharashtra, both these states have regulations for joint titles, but the language of the law says that if a title is allocated to a man, the name of woman would also be included if he is married. So the message that this language gives is that it's the man who is receiving the land and the woman is just the appendage. So I mean that's what everybody carries, and I have seen, consequently, especially in the state of UP and in terms of joint land allocation, that flouting the regulation becomes the norm. So I think we need to make investments in shifting all of this attitude, and especially in the current context where there is a lot of evidence and data which shows that more and more women are engaging in agriculture. So periodic labor force survey of 2017 and 18 suggested 73% of all rural women workers are engaged in agriculture. And we also need to be aware and conscious of the harsh social realities that women have to confront every day in terms of double work burden, restriction on mobility, and a host of discriminatory norms. I think once we are aware of this in our mindsets and the language of the law and the provisions of policies, these should effectively go in the direction so that they pave way for increased rights to resources by women, their inclusion in the extension services, either by government institutions or private institutions, their better access to technology, inputs, markets, and their representation in the decision-making positions at all levels. So that was regarding the larger agricultural transformation. Coming to the land leasing reforms in particular, we have talked about the importance of legalizing leasing. I think there is substantial need to invest in generating awareness and confidence in the changed provisions wherever leasing has been legalized in the states. And this is a need for both lessors as well as lessees. Then I also think that wherever in the states tenancy is recorded, we noted, earlier panelists noted that it's not being recorded in all the states, but wherever it is recorded and in whatever form it's recorded, I think it's important to record the sex of the landowner, lessor or lessee, anyone, so that we have sex desegregated data to analyze and see where this leasing is going, who is leasing out and who is able to lease in. Secondly, I think it's also important to prioritize, facilitate and safeguard access of land by women and Dalits. They have historically been marginalized in their connections with land, and this marginalization continues. If there are a set of landless people in a village who contend for leasing of a certain piece, several studies and my own experience on ground suggest that women and Dalits are ignored and they are neglected disproportionately. As for women, I think landowners and lessors, they doubt the potential and ability of women to be able to cultivate the land and about the profits that they would be making. So especially when women are single and they do not have a young son, lessors think that they will not be able to arrange for timely inputs, and there are other similar inhibitions which prevent them. Similarly, there also are stigmas attached with Dalits. Disproportionate ownership of land by upper caste is not a secret to anyone who is here today. So though there have been efforts of providing land access to Dalits, but most of them have not met the objectives. For example, in Bihar, there are a lot of cases where Bhudan land was allocated to landless Dalits some 50 or more years back, but they have not received the possession even today. In Jharkhand recently, I was noting a disturbing trend that even when tribals and marginalized were given possession on ceiling surplus or Bhudan land years ago, the current generation of the then landholders, they are making claims and saying that their ancestors did this out of law because the ancestors, when gave away their land rights and donated the land, they gave the rights of other people in their family, for example, of their wives. And also, many people are claiming that their ancestors gave away the land in a state of mental insanity. So I thought all of these are really disturbing trends which need to be checked. So I think ignoring the realities and assuming that a neutral law will serve all in the same way is not going to help. I think it's really important that we recognize the vulnerabilities of women and Dalits and all the other vulnerable population segments, and then provide explicit safeguards so that their interests in leasing contexts are protected. And finally, the most important thing which I think I wanted to suggest, and a few of the panelists spoke about it, is leasing by women's groups. We talked about examples from Telangana, examples from Kerala, but I think there is a need to learn from those examples, and there is a need to advocate at the state levels so that the state policies provide flexibility and opportunity for women to lease land collectively. In West Bengal, I have seen that when women farm in groups, they do a lot better in terms of net returns, not only in monetary terms, but also there are benefits beyond that. Women become more confident of their identity as a farmer, they get increased visibility, they play important roles in decision makings. Community also recognizes and supports their efforts, and I think in many ways it leads to changes in gender relations as well. So I think there is a need to draw learnings from the examples which have been set by the states like Telangana and Kerala, and accordingly advocate in states. My conversation with a lot of stakeholders, especially in the state of West Bengal, suggests that officials and policymakers both agree that permitting women groups to formally leasing land is beneficial and also probably easier to accomplish policy-wise. So I think, with these points there, I will take a pause and see if people have any questions or any comments.
Thank you very much, Shipra. I think I can imagine without you how the panel would have been completely ignored this very important issues. This whole thing around this legal vocabularies, the way they are highly patriarchal, and particularly when you look at Land Leasing Model Act, we also need to probably integrate this, moderate this vocabularies, make them more correct, make them more gender, equitable, and also at the same time ensure that the safeguards around Dalit and women farmers must be built. Just taking forward from your conversation, I think some rays of hope have been already emerging, though they are not legally but institutionally, particularly the West Bengal example you taught. So in our work, the case study, we try to document how PepsiCo is again working with Dalit women group around this potato farming and trying to say that this is going to be future mode of farming with them. Similarly, Pradhan in Odisha and Jharkhand and Bihar working with women groups. Kudumbashree in Kerala is giving a lot of incentives around joint liability groups. I think Odisha's Balram project can really draw a lesson from them how these joint liability groups in Kerala are promoted through different area-based incentives, production incentives, and different incentives, and women are recognized more as farmers. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think very insightful and a lot of learning to take forward. we have about 13 minutes left. So before we, because there is, I think, not any question. Dia has, I think, one question for the panelist. Dia, would you like to pose these questions? Why not you pose this question directly? I think that will be really useful. Dia, Uday?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pranav. Good evening to everyone. So I think the question I had was this, right? The level of informality in leasing, perhaps, that we're seeing today is an unseen consequence of continued state intervention in the agricultural leasing market. And this could be because they either prohibited it at one point, or it's highly restrictive, or the fact that there are very, very low rent ceilings. And what these potentially do is disincentivize parties from, engaging in these transactions on market. However, there seems to be, a continued tendency and notion that that state intervention is needed in this area. And I guess my question for the panelists is, do you agree that this could possibly be an unseen consequence? Do you think that there is a need for continued state intervention in an area that's essentially, the realm of private contract, or should be the realm of private contract? And if you think so, then what do you think it's going to take for states to actually, perhaps acknowledge this and move away from interventions? Thanks.
Dia, I think I will take these questions to Dr. Haque first and Dr. Garg later. Now, Dr. Haque providing it, and then if there is some time left, Mercedes, and we can always complement. Dr. Haque, sir. Sir, please unmute your mic.
Okay, Pranav. I think this is a very good question, but the point is, these days, no matter whatever legalization or liberalization you bring about, the state has a role to play. Without a state, being there in the picture, there is always a scope of, the law being misused and the benefits of it being grabbed by some vested interest. So I think there is a need for a state regulation or intervention anyway for anything that you do, and even for, as Saurabh Garg mentioned, that enforcement or the implementation is a main problem here all through, particularly in the case of any reforms that you try to bring about, whether it is Hindu Succession Act, giving land rights to women, or tenancy reform or ceiling laws implementation, or anything that is. But then, since some of these reforms are very critical for transformation, economic development, I think we need to pursue these things very systematically along with proper regulations. So I think, Saurabhji, I think I'll inform you that when you said how do you enforce contract or even the kind of agreements that are there between the landowner and the tenant. In the case of Madhya Pradesh, what they have done is there is very strict, penalty for not, following the contract, or the agreement. For instance, it is a non-bailable offense in the new law that they have passed in Madhya Pradesh on land leasing. So I think that is basically to ensure that landowners get their land back on the expiry of the lease period. So this is one. There are various ways. In fact, no land reform can be universalized that way. In fact, it has to be context specific. It depends also on the social, political, and economic settings in which people live and frame policies. So there are various things. So that's why even in the Model Land Leasing Act, we have said it can be modified or adapted according to the local conditions. So I think this is one. Second, but then, as I told you, even in the case of, if you say there is a free market, land lease market, then the fear that is there that if there is concentration of land, or if there is huge reverse tenancy kind of thing, or if only industrialists coming in a big way and leasing a land and then alienating the poor people, sometime you will say, yes, you will get rent, but then you are not sure whether he will continue to be a landowner in the years to come, because there will be temptation for him to lease out, even sell the land to that particular industrialist or anybody comes. So these are the fears which are expressed by people. And this is one of the reasons why many politicians, in fact, say that I think very sensitive issue, and then we have to discuss more about it and all that. So this is one of the reasons why some states have not really gone ahead, I should say. But this can be addressed through proper dialogue, and then even the law can be defined in a particular context. And implementation mechanism has to be provided, not necessarily that it will be effectively implemented. Even 50% success is there in implementation, I think should be happy. But then slowly with what happens in reality, I think people will go for it. This is, I'm sure. Now 4 states have gone. In the coming years, 7 states will be there. And again, in the next 5 years, maybe all these states will come around this. So I think we're optimistic about it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the intervention. Can I take this question to Dr. Saurabh Garg regarding this question of DIA around informalities?
Yes.
And also,
yes.
Dr.
Just quickly, I will just say 2 points. One is on the role of state as a regulator or as a provider of judicial public good, if I can put it that way. I think that's a role of the state. I don't think there would be any doubt on that or any argument on that. I think it's the second part of the role of state as a protector of the vulnerable or the small and marginal farmers, or as a development activist, if I can put it that way. I think that's the area of role of state there could be some debate around, because it's quite possible that what we are saying is asymmetric information or different bargaining power of the lessee and the lessor, whether there needs to be some kind of a protective mechanism. I think I'll just leave it at that, but I think at present on the second part, because of maybe legacy issues which were mentioned and how laws were post-independence, the kind of mindset that was, I think that is much longer than it should, and there could be some amount of rollback on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garg. I think this is also a kind of interesting question to pose to Mika. What you will draw from the global, particularly East European experience around that? Now, do you also draw some lessons from that which will be useful to us? Mika, can you please unmute? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Broadly speaking and very boldly, because I can't know all the political economy related to this, but broadly speaking, I agree with the question and the hypothesis embedded in the question. I think the global evidence is that the restrictions of land use in lease rights or ownership rights tend not to work. When the market suggests that it's better to grow something else than what the lease right tells you, then you go for it. There is a cutting point when you go with the market. So in my view, a functioning smallholder leasing system does not restrict very much the use of the lease. Secures the lease, and I think the state has a big role, especially in developing contexts, in raising awareness among the farmers, and so that the farmers understand what the asset is and what happens when you dispose in the market and so on. So this awareness raising aspect is more important, I think, than the restrictions and trying to kind of control the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Mika. I think before we presenters and moderator talk, I think I'll give the final floor to Shipra if any concluding remark she would like to give. 2 minutes to you, Shipra.
So I think, Pranav, as you said, in follow on to the points that I made, I think it's important that we learn from the positive examples that are being set at a lot of places. And these days, I mean, within this overall patriarchal scenario of land and revenue and agricultural segments within these within these patriarchal examples, we see people coming up. We see people who are active. We see people who are who are conscious and more supportive of women's rights and giving them an equal footing and helping them move ahead. So I think it's really important that we sincerely draw learnings from them and then replicate them and be open and innovative in designing policies so that they are inclusive everywhere. So with that, I think I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Shipra. I think Professor Dr. Shekhar Shah has a question. So over to you, sir, Professor.
Thanks, Pranav. Great panel. Really, just so good to see so much interest and work coming online in this area. The question is really about what have we learned from the pandemic and all the difficulties that it has created, particularly for returning migrants who may own some land but are not able to realize the value. So the question really is, what is the political economy that we should be working towards that creates the political momentum, whether at the state level, whether at the federal level, to push and nudge these things much harder? Because if imagine a next pandemic, and if we have rational leasing rules, regulations, practices, particularly that address the gender issues we've been discussing, we would be so much better prepared, and it'd be a huge safety net in some sense that we can promote. So the question really is, how can we create the political momentum where it's a vote-getting thing for state chief ministers to do, for central ministers and the parties in power to do? This is such a rich group of panelists, and we have two eminent officers, Saurabh, Deepak, both here, who know the intricacies of, and Professor Haque as well, know the intricacies of how these things are done. It'd be good to just spend a couple of minutes thinking about this, because that is the political momentum we need to create using evidence and data that can move the needle on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shekhar Shah. But before I pose this to panelists, I request the audience to please bear with us for another 10-15 minutes, because we are just 7:59. Our time was allotted till 8. So maybe another 10 minutes or so we will continue. So please bear with us. So I will not pose these questions to anyone, but if any panelist is volunteering to answer, I think this is a very important question.
I will volunteer.
Yes, sir. 2 minutes, sir. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Then only Dr. Shekhar Shah's question only I will try to attend, not other questions. I think, sir, this is a very important question that you posed, particularly in the context of pandemic that we're facing and the kind of security, whether it is food security or otherwise, some kind of social security for the poor people, migrants who don't have a job here in the cities. They came maybe for a short time or for a long time, and then during the pandemic, they had to go back to their native place. But in a native place, if he has a piece of land, secured piece of land, even if it is a small homestead kind of plot, then he feels more secure. Then he does not have to ask Nitish or anybody else for that matter, you give me a job, and since they don't give you a job, and then you are in trouble. So at least you have some security. So from that point of view, I think I will say many of those landless families in West Bengal particularly, about 2.6 lakh families, landless families who were given homestead plot, and the women beneficiaries were huge in this context. So I think there is a place for them to live in, also to earn some money from the kitchen garden in way of producing vegetables or fruits, and keeping some goat or some small ruminants kind of thing, which can generate some income for them. So I think this is a great thing that can be done if we can do at least this much. This can be, great effort to reduce poverty and food insecurity for those people who temporarily or permanently migrate, and then has some backup kind of thing. And not only that, even otherwise, as I said, if there is a proper legal framework for land leasing, then that small man can lease out his land to anybody whosoever is willing to lease him, and there is a market anyway for that, and he gets some rent anyway from that piece of land. And when he goes back, he gets back his land, and he can do his own kind of self-entrepreneurship in that piece of agricultural land. Yeah. So I think that is one thing that I will suggest in this. And secondly, I think there are other things which could be done, like how do we empower women, particularly in this context? And again, if you can ensure that some such schemes can be floated in other states. In fact, we tried. In fact, I tried in Karnataka. I tried in Odisha also under Vasuntara scheme. I visited several times when GBP Sharma was the revenue secretary, and afterwards, of course, he was in the tribal affairs ministry. So I think we tried, and some achievement was there. Not that it was all futile exercise, but then this has to be redone properly in a big way. In fact, it has to be scaled up. So I think I will stop that.
Thank you, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Pranav, since you've taken the liberty of taking on a few minutes, could I just compliment what Professor Haque said and
Please.
ask particularly my World Bank friends, is there a way we can incentivize states through either structural adjustment loans of some sort? I don't know what they're called now. That's what we used to call them when I was in the bank. But ways in which we can incentivize states to move ahead on leasing and support that with obviously reforms that are then underwritten by World Bank loans. That's certainly one way of moving the needle, I would think. And once we start a demonstration effect, then I expect that more and more states will want to come on board. But anyway, just a thought thrown out there.
Mika or Mercedes, would you like to take get to respond about that on that?
Mercedes, would you?
I'm happy to, but do you want to take a first stab at it?
Well, I can just say briefly that I think enabling lease markets would make a good development policy loan target. So I would say yes, there are instruments at the World Bank that can help a willing state to introduce this kind of reforms. So I think we would need champions in a state level who want to do that. But I would think that in our modest way, we could potentially help in this kind of cases and would be definitely very much willing to.
Yeah. Mika, it would be modest in terms of resources, surely, but I think fairly substantive in terms of the knowledge and the procedures and the ease of leasing, so to speak, that you could introduce. So you could really be setting the standard and thinking about, because there's just so much that we need to actually sort out and clean up. And if one state is doing it, then that's just going to have huge demonstration effects on other states.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, just to add really briefly, I fully agree, as Mika mentioned, that I think our development policy lending would be useful here. I believe that there may be few opportunities in the short term for that because of the single borrower limit that India is hitting with respect to its lending overall with the World Bank, but we could also pursue what's called performance for results, P4R lending in India. And I believe that there are discussions underway in one or two states with respect to looking at land records updating in this context. And as Mika mentioned, the World Bank really is demand driven. And so I would encourage Dr. Haque, Mr. Garg, others on the call, if you are aware of state governments that are interested in working with us, please do reach out to me, Mika, and we can have a more detailed discussion about this. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I think.
Okay. Dr. Garg, would you like to?
Yeah, just quickly, I'll just take a minute. Just two things I would suggest is, I think some kind of empirical evidence, either from India or globally, that implementing a land leasing law, number one, does not take away the land from a landowner, or the reverse, that a very small landowner their land does not get taken away on lease by a large corporate and they lose land. So I think that would help, because that's the biggest concern. And the concern is at both ends. For those having large pieces of land, they don't want their land to go. And on the other hand is for the small landholder. And the second point, which good to see Dr. Shah out here, which Dr. Shah mentioned about the returning migrants. I think the extension that we were focusing on the post-harvest activities, given the fact that a lot of the migrants who are coming back one would assume they're slightly more educated than those who are in the village, and they may not be really interested in doing farming, but something on the post-harvest processing, marketing, those activities are something that might interest them. And that's the area that we are trying to focus on agri-entrepreneurship related to something which is related to their land, but moving beyond that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Garg. So I think
Pranav, could we also hear just briefly from Deepak Sanan, since Deepak is so
sure.
wedded and embedded in this area. Deepak?
Real pleasure. It will be.
I was waiting to conclude because we've already exceeded time, but I did have a comment and I thought I'd make it as a concluding comment on today's discussion. So I'll wait for Pranav to call a conclusion to this session, and I will make my comment thereafter so that I don't have to make two comments.
Thank you, sir. I think we must be very much, penurious in terms of time. Thank you. I think I will not take much time, concluding, because a lot has been said, and I think the panelists have really added a lot of value to this, discussions, and that's why I think we had very less questions. I think two things are very important here. If you look at the question they are raised, informality is, I think, something which is a inevitable reality in the context like India, where land is scarcity and labor is a surplus. And in situation like this, when you look at the global examples, in this context, small farms become more efficient, and when people have less purchasing power, they tend to lease in. So that is the reason why the leasing in is increasing meteorically when there is so much of restrictions. But at the same time, we also see, if in the COVID context, a lot of land deprivation, clearly the reason behind migration. The migration studies, one of our paper is now just getting published around that. So where we have tried to highlight how most of the migrants who are coming back, either they are landless or they are part-time tenants. And there is a study by World Bank which talks about that in future there are a lot of part-time farmers. So like people would be going to cities because the services and manufacturing sector will going to now absorb less and less people because they are going to be more and more efficient. So there will be less opportunities in urban jobs and more people would resort to cyclic migration. In that context, it is very important to see how we make this land available to the people willing to till in the villages. So be it the fallow land, which is like 25 million hectares in India. And when you look at the states like Jharkhand, it was coming about 50 hectares per village. It is Odisha, it is about 30 hectares per village. The data sets, we have to look at the reality. So that also provide a very good kind of opportunity to see how women collective groups, how landless farmers as JLGs can take up cultivation of these things. And being small farming, being more efficient in India, I think that can provide a bigger solution. So with this, I'll close this session, and I hope with all your inputs, we'll be able to provide a better feedback to Government of India and the states in terms of how they should go with land leasing forward, land leasing reform. I have taken note of this point of Dr. Garg regarding the empirical evidence. Just for your kind information, apart from the evidence that Mika would be sharing, we have just started a study in 4 states of India under the guidance of Dr. Haque to see how the states who have adopted land leasing reform, how they are responding to that, how the farmers are looking at that, how state is implementing that. I think with that short-term study, we'll be able to provide more insights into to the states. I'll stop here, and I'll thank all the panelists. I'll thank all the audience who were at one point of time about 60, but still now at 8:10, there are 38 participants. So without you, this session would not have been very useful. Thank you very much. And I close it here and hand it over to Deepak Sanan sir for his final.
Thank you, Pranav, for putting together a really excellent panel and a great discussion. The whole of today has been interesting at one level. I think I'm going to end by pointing out that today's 2 sessions, in a sense, the discussant of the first session raised the question that the answers seem to be there. The question is how to make it happen. In the context of the first session today, the issue was, how do we change the forms of title registers? How do we change the way we value property in ways that will make it more efficient? which would make it better? I think the answer there is not very difficult. It is a question of building capacity of personnel in the state, in government, to address these issues. And to my mind, a much simpler task than what your panel, the discussion we are ending now, raised. Because to take Saurabh's point on this, and I echo that to an extent, to a large extent, what Saurabh said, this is an area where the behavior of the public is involved. It's no longer about just personnel of the state redesigning something and putting it into place, a process and a procedure, and things will start happening. Here is a question of the public has to actually do something which you want them to do. And for them to do this is a much larger question of trust. Trust in institutions of the state, trust in action of the state. And that's where we are lacking. As Saurabh very rightly pointed out, this is analogous to housing in urban areas. You can keep crying hoarse from the rooftops and say, why don't you rent it out? But there isn't enough trust in institutions of the state and in action by the state to do those things. So when you say that large holders would rather leave fallow than lease, small holders would not trust to lease out when they are leaving for work in the city, there is this issue of trust in government institutions in the state. And that I am not sure I have an answer. Can we resolve it very easily? Perhaps, as Shekhar says, we need to incentivize states to think in terms of how can they focus on output and outcomes, not simply passing laws, but how do we really have databases which assess that something is happening post those laws? And can we then therefore focus on those and incentivize those actions? I can leave you with these thoughts. I have nothing more to add to this. In any case, it's very late. We look forward to more and more fruitful discussions tomorrow when we really have very interesting discussions on gender issues in land in India and on issues of collateral and credit, using land as collateral for credit. I look forward to most of you coming back tomorrow and being with us for another fruitful day. Thank you very much for being with us this long day. Thank you, all of you.